So our built environment is responsible for nearly 40% of all carbon emissions, and that includes everything from the daily heating and cooling of buildings to the emissions created from raw materials used to make them. And the embodied carbon from materials in the construction process amounts to more than a quarter of that figure, around 11%. So if we're going to reduce the carbon dioxide and other gases that we're adding into the atmosphere, we simply have to do something to tackle construction. And with demand for new buildings and refurbishments set to climb, it's not a question of simply reducing the amount of construction we carry out. So today on Climate Solutions News, I'm delighted to welcome Brittany Harris, who's co-founder and CEO of QFlow, a construction technology company focused on cutting waste and carbon by using real-time data from construction sites. QFlow captures that data at source, and it replaces paper tickets and spreadsheets with verified digital records. And the aim is very simple but ambitious, and that's to make one of the world's most carbon-intensive industries more transparent, more efficient, and easier to decarbonize. And QFlow works across major infrastructure and building projects in multiple markets, helping contractors and developers understand what's really happening on site. So, Brittany, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us today. And just to kick things off, pleasure. And just to kick things off, give us a bit about your background, because I think you worked actually on construction projects on site when you started your career.
Yeah, so my background's in civil engineering. So I trained as a civil engineer and then went on to work for the likes of Bureau Happold. And it was while I was working for them that I met my co-founder, Jade. So she's also from the construction industry. She used to work for Skanska. She was on Crossrail and then later HS2. And when we met, we sort of, I guess, bonded over this love-hate relationship we have with construction. Because as you said, it's this incredible industry that, builds the world around us. It gives us access to water and transport and places to live and work. But it also has this horrendous dark side that it is insanely consumptive from a material perspective, and the supply chain that services that is incredibly environmentally damaging and often has human rights abuses and is just very, very hard to manage, but also very carbon intensive as well. So when we sort of got together, we were sort of saying, okay, we really want to make this world a more sustainable place. And we actually started working on a project around water and sanitation, which was my background. I was a water engineer. But we found that the sort of not-for-profit model really couldn't scale or have the pace of impact and change that we wanted to see. And so in the end, we founded QFlow back in 2018 to tackle our own industry, construction, one that we really love but get quite frustrated by, but to also try and do that at pace so that we can ultimately see the changes that we need to see today, and help the industry get there in a way that is appropriate for them. And I think anyone who's worked in construction will have seen this sort of mass launching of technology that doesn't necessarily understand the industry and the nuances of it and some of the challenges it faces. And actually the sort of appropriateness of how technology is deployed, how complex it is really critical for its ability to really add value in our industry. And so we've really focused on that, as well as thinking about, how do we design and deploy technology to help the industry as opposed to just getting in the way.
And you really focus on the data, don't you? What was it that convinced you that data's the way to solve this as opposed to any other route?
I was reflecting on this the other day because I met an old colleague who I was working on a construction site in Hong Kong, for Rework back then. And I didn't realise I had this obsession with data, but then I was just an undergrad at this point. And I realised back then the one innovation that I brought to that project was a data system to track plant breakdown using WhatsApp messaging. And this was decades ago now. And it was only when I was chatting to him that I was like, oh my God, I've been obsessed with data for a really long time. And I think the reason is that I could really see that we had this massive issue on site with plant breaking down and people not finding out until sometimes the next shift. which obviously then meant that we weren't able to get people to get out and fix it. And so we had these like constant delays on site. And the issue there is that the information about that plant being broken wasn't making it up to the people who needed to know. And the regularity and the patterns with which that plant was breaking down also weren't identifiable because this was being done in a really ad hoc and incomplete way. And so I was like, well, surely if we have better visibility and we have better consistency of data, we can actually start preventing this plant from breaking down in the first place, but also addressing the problem more quickly. And so I think that's kind of been embedded in the way that I like to think about the world anyway. And QFlow is just a much broader extension of that to say, well, we have these massive problems with materials coming onto site that either they aren't the right stuff, they're in the wrong quantities, they're at the right time, they're not approved against the design or the suppliers. And we're just dealing with that in a very ad hoc way in construction currently. And we're dealing with the side effect of that, which is mass scale rework, which is incredibly expensive and time consuming, and incredibly environmentally damaging because you're generating waste that never should have been generated in the first place. So we sort of started thinking about.
Talk a little bit more about that. Talk a little bit more about that rework and just explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, so about 30% of rework is down to materials mismanagement. And it can be simple things like, the designer specified a certain type of pipe. When the subcontractor went to go and buy that piece of pipe, it wasn't available on the market or it had gone up in price, which we're seeing a lot at the moment. Material price inflation is a huge problem because you've often got sort of 6 months between design and construction and sometimes more. And so that subcontractor will go, well, that's no longer in my budget, so I'll buy this other thing that might look the same. It might be the same dimensions, but it might not have the same structural or safety rating. So in our example we had from a client is that this happened and the pipe that was procured didn't have the same fire rating as what was required because this pipe was actually going to be conveying electrical cables. But what happened was that pipe got delivered to site. No one spotted that it wasn't the right type of pipe and that it wasn't from the right supplier because it had the same dimensions. So they installed it. And then only later when they did a proper inspection did they go, oh my God, this pipe isn't fire rated. This could result in a massive fire under this station platform. We need to rip this out. But by then, other stuff had been installed on top as well. So it wasn't just a matter of replacing the pipe. It was breaking out the concrete, replacing out other elements that had been laid on top of it. So the overall knock-on effect was about 2 weeks delay in program because they had to go back and fix it, but also massive cost and material waste as well. So a small thing like the substitution of a pipe can have these crazy knock-on effects that ultimately end up costing our industry billions every year.
And is that a real sort of a systemic problem within the sector? Does that happen an awful lot, or is it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the really heartbreaking thing about this is if you speak to anyone in construction, they will all have an anecdote of how this has happened to them on site. Every single person I've spoken to has had some example of how this has happened to them. And if you ask them, what did that cost you? They're like, oh, I don't know. We didn't really do an autopsy on it, but I would guess probably a couple of weeks program and $500,000. And you're just like, okay, so you seem very laid back about this. But the reality is our industry has to move so fast. And for an industry that, people think move very slowly, these projects are incredibly tightly under a lot of restrictions around time and progress. So they don't necessarily have that time to go back and reflect and start to quantify the impact of these errors. So instead, they have these buffers in their budget that is typically about 20% of the program, depending on the complexity of the project. And they just say, yeah, we've got a 20% error rate. So we've just held back 20% of the cost of this project to fix mistakes. And that's just how the industry operates. And it's mad.
And the example you gave, I mean, it could be naivety, it could be, a supplier wanting to kind of, make sure that they deliver even though it's not quite right, et cetera, et cetera. But, to what extent is there malicious intent behind this sometimes. So, are suppliers, deliberately swapping things out? Is there fraud involved in the process as well, or is it actually just genuinely mistakes and
Yeah,
naivety?
it's really hard to say definitively. And I'm sure there is a small element of fraud going on here. Like, if there's an opportunity to be had, someone will be taking it. But I genuinely think that the majority of the time, the industry is trying to do the best with what it's got. But unfortunately, the conveyance and the feedback loops of that information they're not there at the moment. And so for the designer, they will know the criticality of that pipe, but the person procuring it, they're not necessarily the person who was even involved in the bid or the tender. And so they won't necessarily understand the significance of that pipe in the station in this case. So when they go actually just go and buy it, then they'll be like, oh, well, it's near enough. And I've got to get this done. Otherwise, if I don't get this pipe on site in time, then I delay the program and that's got a cost as well. So they're constantly battling with these very challenging constraints. And ultimately, someone else is then responsible for checking it. But that person on site is overrun with thousands of different deliveries to check. And so it's a very difficult thing to do at scale. But this is where technology can be such a fantastic partner to construction, is to actually say, well, you are the sort of human brain is really, really capable of taking these actions and making these difficult calls and these decisions. But what technology can do is surface the risks and say, okay, you've had this pipe delivered. It doesn't match the design specification. And here's the evidence. Here's the receipt of the pipe and here's the design spec. You can now make the judgment call whether this substitution is acceptable or whether actually it's a risk and you need to remove it on site. Now, there is so much context and complexity to these projects that technology is going to really struggle to make that judgment call at the moment, even with the amazing sort of AI models that we're seeing coming out. So humans are still going to have to be there to take that judgment, but the technology can actually assess, like, of the 1,000 sort of deliveries that I've seen, these 10 are ones that you need to pay attention to. And of these 10, they can then make a call and say, 5 of those are totally fine. 5 of those are a problem I need to address before they incur rework, before they incur cost.
So how does QFlow work? Do you provide only the technology platform, or do you also have people going on site to work with the teams and log materials coming into the
So
construction
yeah,
site? How does it?
we're pure software. So we don't supply bodies. But what I mentioned earlier is this sort of real fixation on trying to make QFlow as simple as possible to use and appropriate for the site teams. So because in construction you often have lots of different languages, quite a high turnover of staff, and not necessarily the capability to train them in every single system they're going to be using. They need to be trained in health and safety. They need to be trained in sort of the site specifics and the toolbox talks, but the sort of every bit of software they may not know. So what we've done with QFlow is the people on site who are using it to capture the data, all they have to be able to do is take a selfie. It's like, it's that idiot proof in the nicest way possible. So it's literally just taking a photograph on a phone and that's all they have to do. And it's structured in the app that it's just 2 clicks. It's like take picture, hit send. The people who are then using the data, that's a little bit more involved. And we have a really dedicated customer success team that then help our clients make sure that they're getting the most value from that data. Whether that's feeding it into other systems that they're using, like Autodesk or Procore, or whether it's about analysing it themselves and looking at their sort of supply chain risk and who their key suppliers are for certain materials. So we support them to basically get the most out of the data, but the actual capturing of the data is so simple, we don't have to be involved.
Very good. And you help sort of up the chain as well with overall reporting at company level. Is that correct?
So the data that QFlow provides is often fed up into these corporate reports. Our focus is to help them get the most out of the data, not to do it for them. So we don't do any specific reporting because every company does it differently. And so productizing these sorts of reports is a fool's game because everyone wants it slightly different. So instead, what we do is we focus on making that data really accessible so that they can pull it out and manipulate it and structure it into the way that they need for their corporate reporting. And if they're using consistent corporate reporting tools, so if they're doing like a whole life carbon assessment, then they might be using one-click LCA or EC3. Then we push the data into those systems so that they can have that consistency of structure. But at the core, QFlow is a data platform. We're capturing, cleaning, structuring, enriching, so filling a lot of gaps of data and then making that data accessible and valuable to project teams.
And as I mentioned at the top, I mean, construction is such a huge emitting sector that regulators are getting very focused on it. And new measures like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe have been coming online. How are those regulatory pressures changing conversations with your customers? And are you seeing a big shift because of it?
Yeah, it's been really fascinating. In many ways, I think regulation is a fantastic thing because it really forces people to focus on the things that matter. So, carbon reporting regulation has helped really focus people's minds on saying, actually, we do need proper data behind this as opposed to doing very high level estimates. And that's been a great tailwind for us because, traditionally it's been very difficult for them to get hold of that data, but QFlow provides it in a very light touch way. On top of that, we've seen other regulation that's particularly in the UK. We've had the changes to the Building Safety Act, which has required this capturing of what they call the golden thread of data. So this is understanding right from design all the way through construction, through to operation, what materials went into those buildings, what standards did they meet, are they fire safe? And the main focus is on fire safety. Were they installed appropriately and are they being maintained and operated? And so the regulation that we're seeing coming through has this real focus on data, on transparency, on accountability, and on being able to connect those steps in the process because construction has traditionally been very siloed. You have the design team, they hand it off to contractors. That's not their problem. You have the contractors, they build it, they hand it off to the operation mason team, and they go, we've done our checks, it's all new. Now trying to create that data thread that connects all of those pieces so that we can better build and design and actually manage these assets in a way that is safe and sustainable.
And how do you see attitudes differing across different regions? Are there certain regions that are taking it more seriously than others? Others maybe rowing back on some of these
Yeah, so
issues?
as you know, we operate in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and most recently in Central Europe as well. So we've got sites in France and Switzerland and kicking off in Germany in the new year. So Europe obviously has a much stronger focus around sustainability reporting. And the regulation and the legislation around that is certainly driving that. And so sustainability within Europe, we found is embedded more as business as usual, but it's also drifted into this slightly sad position of we're doing it because we're regulated and it's now a slight frustration. And I think there's been a slight disconnect to the why and the intent behind it. That depends who you're talking to. And there's some incredibly passionate and engaged people in this industry who just fill me with joy and hope because they really do understand the why. And regulation is really about bringing up the laggards. It's not about leading the pack. So there are amazing people leading the pack, and then the regulation makes sure that everyone else kind of follows suit as appropriate. So we see that mostly in Europe. In North America, it's slightly different. There definitely has been a bit of a stepping away from sustainability and a sort of almost a rebranding. There's a lot more talk of resilience. There's a lot more talk of sort of quality and cost control and efficiency. But particularly when it comes to materials and waste, it's exactly the same thing. So in the US, there's a big focus on supply chain resilience and trying to onshore a lot of their supply chain through the Buy American Act. And again, in that, they need really good data about where those materials are coming from. There is an element of that is actually sort of looking at the carbon efficiency of those pieces as well for certain states, because California layers in the Buy Clean Act on top of that. So there are the sort of same information drive is coming through for the same kind of data, which is really interesting, but for slightly different reasons. What gives me hope is that as opinions and sort of political whims change again, as they inevitably do, they will already have the data they need to go back and carry out those sustainability assessments and really understand their risk and opportunity as well. So it's a tough time at the moment for sustainability professionals, and I really do feel for them because so many of them are fighting quite a brutal uphill battle. but there is light on the horizon. And I certainly think that by sort of focusing on getting that data now, they can still do those amazing things in the future and catch up very quickly.
QFlow is playing an increasingly big part in this. So tell us how the company's going. What's the kind of, what have you achieved recently, and what are you aiming to achieve with
Yeah.
the company in the future?
It's been an absolutely mad journey. So when we founded the company in 2018, sustainability was still not really a thing in construction. There were a few pioneers leading the way, the likes of Canary Wharf, who were our first client. And then it was sort of just trying to figure out around the edges around how we help them meet regulation and how we start to help them get a grip on these key materials that were causing problems. But then all of a sudden we had the pandemic, and 2021 saw this massive shift in the industry to say, actually, no, we are a part of this global climate change problem. You had the contractors declare movement where they all said, we hold our hands up, we get that we're part of the problem, we're also part of the solution, and we're going to work towards that. And so 2021 to sort of 2023, we started seeing some of that really positive intent from the industry. But then we had the fallout from the pandemic where we had mass inflation, we had incredibly sort of challenging supply chain dynamics. We had the war in Ukraine, which affected a lot of the material supply to the UK because materials from places like Russia and Belarus were considered conflict materials. So where we relied on them for timber, we couldn't. So all of these dynamics have really shifted the focus and the pressures on the industry. And so over the last few years, there's been a sort of, okay, we'd love to do sustainability, but we're just trying to stay afloat for construction. And so they've started to focus more on their core bits around being, liquid effectively and trying to make projects economically stack up. And so QFlow's had to really adapt to that. Early on, we were just finding our feet and solving a very specific problem. We were then able to expand that to solve a much broader problem around construction decarbonisation and all material responsible supply and management. And we were able to focus our messaging around decarbonising construction. We've had to really think about how we engage the industry and help them reach their outcome. What outcome are they trying to achieve, which is cost-effective, sustainable, efficient construction. And so we've changed our messaging as well to focus on that ground truth, to focus on that data that provides them the value cases, which is helping them manage quality. So are they delivering what they said they would? Helping manage cost. Are they doing that cost effectively and not generating all this wasted money? But also still managing that sustainability piece. And so the company as a whole has evolved and adapted around the industry to make sure we're helping them achieve the outcomes. So the last year has been so exciting from a product perspective because we've been doing so much around this quality control piece, to be able to map deliveries back against design and say, is this what you're expecting? Are you happy with that? Is there a risk here? And really bringing to the surface some of those risks and opportunities for construction. And so that's gone live literally in the last few weeks. We've got a load of clients on the pilot program for that. And over the course of next year, I'm super excited to see some of the impacts of that. And we plan on taking that a hell of a lot further between closing this loop between design and construction, and ideally moving it into construction operation as well, so that we start to get towards this golden thread of what materials are we putting in our buildings? Are they the right ones? And what does that mean for our sustainability and our efficiency moving forward? So going from can we solve a pain point of the material coming onto site, does it meet your basic requirements, to the material coming onto site, what ripple effects does this have across your entire project in your supply chain? So I'm so excited about the product for next year and some of the releases that we've already started putting out, and hearing how the industry uses that, not just to drive better sustainability outcomes, which is what we want them to do, but also to save them time and money and improve quality of projects, because that is where the industry is really focused right now and what's going to help deliver sustainability at scale.
Very good. Well, very best of luck with it. And thank you very much, Brittany Harris, for joining us today. It's fascinating to hear about the sector as a whole and also about QFlow. And it sounds like you're in a very positive position to take things forward. So very best of
Thanks,
luck.
Tom. Yeah, cheers. I look
Thank you.
forward to it.
Thank you.
Bye.